The frost hadn't yet melted when Cal Whitmore stepped barefoot onto the front porch of his family's homestead. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the plains, like a hand over a wound. Cal, barely 14 and built like the wind might carry him away if it had a mind to, cradled something against his chest, a patchwork quilt stitched years ago by his grandmother, faded by use, frayed at the corners. One patch still held the scent of cedar. He didn't wear a coat, didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just listened to something quieter than wind, something his bones noticed before his ears did. The barn stood at the edge of their land, crooked and half swallowed by weeds. No one had used it much since butchering season ended, except the crows that perched like shadows along the broken fence posts. It smelled of dust, blood, and cold hay, the kind of cold that sinks deep into the wood and waits. Cal moved, slow boots crunching the ground that hadn't thawed since last night. He heard it again, not the wind, not an animal. Something softer, something human. She was there, curled at the base of the fence, her body folded like someone had dropped her and left. Her legs were bare, cracked and bleeding at the soles. Her dress, a once beautiful piece of buckskin and beads, clung to her like it remembered someone else's name. A dark braid fell over her shoulder, stiff with blood. Her skin was the color of riverbank stone, and her breathing was so shallow Cal wasn't sure it was real. For a long moment he just stood there watching. Her fingers clutched something, a small leather pouch strung with red and blue beads clenched tight in her fist like a lifeline. Her lips were split open and dark with scabs. When her eyes fluttered open, they didn't focus right away. But then they found his. There was no pleading in them, just watching. Cal's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to ask something, anything, but all he said was, "Are you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. He looked back toward the house, just a sliver of roof visible past the cornstalk stubble. His father was likely inside, sharpening the axe for kindling. His mother heating tea or mending a coat. No one would miss him for a few minutes. He knelt slowly and unfolded the quilt. She winced when the fabric touched her shoulders, not from pain, but something deeper, like shame. Still, she didn't push it off. She didn't look away either. She just held his gaze, and for the first time Cal really saw her, not just the bruises and cuts, but the way she was trying to stay human beneath them. Like her soul had gone quiet but hadn't yet left. He whispered, "I won't tell anyone." No answer, but her hand twitched. He stayed with her until the sky began to shade itself toward dusk. Then just before he stood to leave, she whispered something, a breath more than a word. He leaned closer. "Aya." He blinked. "Aya." She nodded once, slow and heavy. Cal smiled, though his lips were tight with fear and wonder. "I'm Cal." She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. She just closed her eyes again, and the wind pulled through the barn slats like a secret being told. That night, supper was quiet. His mother stirred stew she didn't eat. His father cleaned the rifle twice. Cal barely touched his plate. He stared at the front door like something sacred had been left outside, and he wasn't sure if he'd be brave enough to go back and get it. Before dawn, he did. The next morning, the sun rose slow and pale over the plains like it was still deciding whether to shine. Cal Whitmore moved through the frost as if the prairie might wake up angry if he stepped too hard. His boots left careful imprints on the white grass, each one vanishing slightly behind him, as though even the earth agreed that some moments were meant to stay hidden. Tucked beneath his coat was a dented tin cup of warm water, a heel of bread from last night's supper, and a piece of smoked pork wrapped in cheesecloth. He hadn't told his parents anything. Didn't plan to. What could he even say? "There's a woman bleeding to death in our barn, and I gave her grandma's quilt." They wouldn't have asked questions. They would have reached for the rifle. He slipped through the side door of the barn, careful not to let it creak. Inside, the shadows still clung to the rafters and the horses snorted softly in their stalls. The air held the scent of dust, old leather, and something else now human and fading. At the back, under a blanket of straw and patched fabric, Aya Morningstar was still there, still breathing. The quilt steamed faintly where her chest rose and fell beneath it. Her braid was looser than before, draped over one shoulder, and her face was drawn tight with fever or memory, he couldn't tell which. She stirred when he approached, eyes opening just enough to catch the faint glow of morning slipping through the slats. She blinked slowly as if deciding whether he was real. Cal knelt beside her and offered the tin cup first. "It's not much," he said, voice barely louder than the horse's breath. "But it's warm." She didn't move at first. Then with a trembling hand she reached out and took it, her fingers grazing his. Her skin was dry, hot, fevered. She drank in sips, each swallow looking like it took more effort than it should have. Cal waited, watching her like someone might a wounded bird, afraid to scare it, afraid to touch it too hard and break something permanent. After a while she lowered the cup and looked at him more directly. Her eyes had changed. Not warm, not trusting, but present, awake. Seeing him, not just seeing around him. He handed her the bread. She held it for a long moment without eating. "Salt's in the meat," he murmured, nudging the cloth forward. "You need it. You're bleeding inside." Aya took the food, tore a corner of it off, and chewed slowly. Her lips cracked again, a bead of blood at the edge. She didn't flinch. Cal sat back on an overturned feed bucket, unsure of what to do with his hands. The silence between them didn't feel empty, it felt thick, lived in, like something sacred had been left there by accident. "You talk more today," he said finally, though she hadn't spoken yet. "Your eyes look less gone." She tilted her head, voice scratchy but clearer. "Less dying, maybe?" He chuckled, a breath, really. "Good enough." The quiet stretched again. Somewhere outside, a hawk cried once over the ridge, and the wind followed close behind it. Aya pulled the blanket tighter. Her fingers trembled, but her spine stayed straight. Stronger today, Cal thought. Still fragile, but not broken. "You have people?" he asked gently. "Family." She nodded, once her gaze falling. "I did." He didn't press. Instead, he answered the same question she hadn't asked. "My folks are alive, just don't see much." He paused, looked down at his boots. "They'd tell me not to help you." Aya blinked slowly. "But you did anyway." Cal shrugged. "Didn't feel right leaving you." She was quiet a long while, chewing slowly. "Then that's dangerous." "I know." She coughed, sharp and sudden, curling slightly over herself. Cal jumped forward to steady her. The quilt slipped from her shoulders for a second, revealing dark purple bruises painted across her ribcage like a map of every place she'd been hurt. His hands froze in midair. Aya noticed. Her fingers moved quick to pull the quilt back in place. "I didn't mean to see," Cal said quietly, voice tight. "You did." She didn't sound angry, just resigned. "Doesn't matter. No one cares." "I do." That stopped her. She looked at him, really looked, as if trying to decide whether that was a kindness or a threat. Then she nodded once. Small, almost nothing, but enough. By midday, Cal had pulled the old ash bucket out of the corner and built a small fire in the feed trough, letting the smoke curl gently through the cracks in the roof. Aya scooted closer to the warmth. Her hands, thin, chapped bird-like, hovered above the flame like they weren't used to permission. Cal sat across from her, elbows on knees, staring into the flicker. "You're not afraid of me," she said after a while. It wasn't a question. Cal shook his head. "I'm afraid of a lot of things. But you're not one of them." She didn't answer, but he saw it the way her hand pulled the quilt closer, the way her shoulders dropped a little, like the weight wasn't just on her anymore. That afternoon, she swept the stall with a broken broom. Cal didn't ask why. Some things didn't need permission, and as the fire hissed and the barn warmed, something between them began to settle, not like a friendship, not yet. More like a truce, or maybe something older, something wordless, something real. The next morning, the prairie didn't wake so much as hold its breath. The wind had shifted sometime before dawn, not colder, just different. It didn't rattle the barn slats or carry the scent of frost like usual. It moved with purpose, almost as if it was coming to deliver a message. Cal Whitmore noticed it before he opened his eyes, that strange stillness, like the world had paused its spinning to wait for something to arrive. When he finally did rise and slip his boots on, the air outside didn't greet him. It met him head on, watching. Aya Morningstar was already awake when he entered the barn. Her color had improved just slightly, lips still chapped, but her eyes clearer now, steadier. She sat cross-legged near the feed trough, turning a piece of carved wood in her hand. It looked like an elk or maybe a fox, the detail rough but reverent, the kind of carving done not for beauty but memory. Cal crouched beside her and she handed it over without a word. He turned it in his fingers. "Did you make this?" She shook her head. "My brother did, a long time ago." "Is he?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. When he stepped out of the barn to fetch more water from the well, that's when he saw them. At first he thought the trees were playing tricks on him, the way branches can sometimes shift and mimic figures when your eyes are still half asleep. But as he blinked, squinting into the ridge that ran behind their property like a jagged skewer, his stomach dropped. There were people there. Dozens, maybe more. They weren't moving. They weren't approaching. They simply stood, mounted, silent, motionless, lined across the crest like sentinels carved into the horizon. No banners, no torches, no sound of hooves or rattles. Just figures still and watching. The morning sun hadn't yet risen high enough to catch them, so they looked like shadows cut from the land itself. Cal stood frozen, the metal pail in his hand, trembling just enough to spill a line of water at his feet. Back inside, he found Aya standing near the barn's side door, staring toward the ridge like she'd already known. Her face was unreadable, not fear, not surprise, something closer to memory. He moved to her side. "They're here for you, aren't they?" he whispered. She didn't respond. He tried again. "Should I be worried?" She finally spoke, her voice low. "Not yet." The answer didn't help, but the way she said it, calm, like naming the weather, kept him from panicking. For now. The rest of the day passed under a sky that refused to settle. His father, Gideon Whitmore, noticed it too. By late morning, he was already pacing the porch, cleaning the rifle not once but 3 separate times. Cal helped move firewood from the shed just to stay busy. His eyes constantly drifting toward the ridge. The riders hadn't moved not 1 inch. They were still there, still watching like ghosts who hadn't decided yet whether to haunt or pass on. By noon, his mother Eleanor had finally spoken what no one else dared. "They haven't come down. Maybe they're just passing." Gideon had snorted the kind of sound that said more than words. That many Comanche don't just pass. Aya stayed in the barn all day, quiet but never once asking to hide. Cal brought her food, sat with her for a while as she stared through the cracks in the boards. She said very little, but he noticed her body was no longer curled inward. She sat upright. Her back was straighter. It wasn't strength exactly, it was steadiness. As twilight began to fall, one figure detached from the ridgeline. Cal watched from the window of the barn's loft. The man rode slow, not with hesitation, but with the kind of patience that comes from knowing no one will stop you. His horse was pale scarred across the flank. His cloak was made from buffalo hide worn to a soft gray around the shoulders. The rider's hair was long streaked with iron gray, and his posture was regal without effort. He carried no weapon visible. He didn't need one. Aya stepped out beside Cal, her body going still. "You know him," Cal said. Her voice came soft. "Yes, his name is Iron Elk." The name struck something in Cal, half from the stories whispered in saloons, half from the weight it carried just in sound. A leader, a memory, a man so dangerous he no longer had to raise his voice to be heard. Gideon met him at the gate, rifle in hand, but not raised. The two men stared at each other, dust rising between their boots. "I was told," Iron Elk said, not loudly, but it carried, "that one of our blood lay dying on this land. And a settler's son gave her his only blanket." Gideon's mouth twitched. "My son's been nowhere near your kind." Iron Elk didn't blink. "Are you sure?" Eleanor stepped forward from the porch, then her hands clasped tight. "If he did it out of kindness." "No," Iron Elk replied. "He did it out of honor." The word echoed, not through the air, but through something deeper. From the barn, Cal stepped forward slowly, hands at his sides, heart pounding like hooves in his chest. He moved until he stood just between the two men, a boy framed by the sun sliding low behind the plains. "I gave her the blanket," he said. "She would have died, but she didn't." Iron Elk looked at him fully for the first time. "And why did you help her?" Cal's voice was rough. "Because no one else did." Iron Elk nodded, slow and solemn. Then, to everyone's surprise, he knelt, one knee in the dirt, head bowed. And far above, along the ridge, every mounted figure followed. One by one, hundreds of warriors slid from their horses and lowered themselves to the ground in total silence. The sound of it, that soft shuffle of boots and prayer and bone, rolled like a forgotten hymn across the land. Gideon slowly lowered the rifle. Eleanor touched her chest, tears in her eyes. And Cal stood there, a boy between worlds, as the sun burned the frost gold around them. The days that followed the kneeling of the warriors were strangely quiet, not in the way of absence, but like the land itself was waiting. Waiting to see if the moment would be honored or forgotten. The ridge had emptied, the watchers returned to the horizon, and the barn returned to its rhythm, straw-swept horses fed, and the soft crackle of a fire built from driftwood and patience. Aya Morningstar had begun to move through the days with more steadiness. Not fully healed, not smiling yet, but her hands were stronger, her voice less smoke. She laughed once, just barely, when Cal Whitmore burned the stew. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then the rider came. He appeared 2 mornings after the thaw, cutting across the snow-dusted plain with a purpose that made Cal's stomach tighten. Alone. No war paint, no torch, no weapon in hand, but every part of him carried something dangerous, as if the silence around him was trained. His coat was dark wolfskin stitched with red thread. His face was lean, marked with old scars that didn't speak of battle so much as consequence. And his eyes, when they found the house and the barn, were sharp with something Aya would later name entitlement. Cal saw him first from the chicken shed and walked back slow, not wanting to wake the land too soon. Aya stood already at the barn window, still wrapped in Cal's quilt, her hair now loose over her shoulders like she wasn't hiding anymore. But as she saw the rider, her posture changed, not with fear, but with a memory she didn't want returning. "Do you know him?" Cal asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," she whispered. "His name is Crow Harper." The name fell heavy. Cal had never heard it, but he could feel the shape of it in her mouth. Not grief, not longing, something sharper, something unfinished. Gideon stood on the porch with the rifle but didn't lift it. The way Crow Harper dismounted slow, unhurried boots crunching snow with the weight of someone used to getting answers made it clear this wasn't a man coming to ask permission. He looked from the barn to the boy to the rifle, then back to the barn again. Aya stepped out into the cold before anyone called her. She walked slowly, deliberately, bare feet pressing into the snow like it didn't matter if it stung. The quilt trailed behind her. She looked smaller somehow, but straighter. Crow stopped 10 feet from her. "You left," he said. Not a greeting, a statement. Aya's voice came even. "Yes, you didn't say goodbye." "I wasn't yours to leave." Cal stepped forward slightly, but Aya held out a hand without turning. "Not yet." Crow's mouth twitched. "You wore the red necklace. I was a child," she said, "and I wore it because I was told it meant honor, not ownership. I never touched you in anger." "No," she said softly. "You touched me with expectation, and that's slower poison." A gust of wind cut between them. Gideon tensed behind Cal, the rifle now lifted slightly, not at shoulder but not forgotten. Eleanor stood by the doorway, one hand clenched in her apron, watching as though the outcome of the world depended on this moment. Crow's jaw clenched. "You belong with us." Aya shook her head. "I belong where I choose." He turned as if finally noticing Cal. "Is this the boy?" Cal met his gaze. "I'm not hers either. She's not a possession." Crow's face darkened. "You gave her the settler's blanket." Cal nodded. "Because she was cold, not because I wanted her." Crow stepped forward, and now the space between them thickened, not with violence but with the weight of all the things men are taught to expect from women who survive them. "She was promised," he muttered, "and she survived," Cal said. "Not to be claimed, but to be free." There was no shouting, no sudden lunge. But something in the barn behind them creaked like it had heard the edge of the old world breaking. Aya turned back to Crow one last time. "You came all this way, and still you don't see me." His shoulders fell an inch. His hand twitched, not for a weapon, but for a habit. Then he mounted again. The horse turned without a command and vanished into the gray tree line. No one spoke. It wasn't over, and yet something had finished. That night, Aya didn't speak much. She sat by the fire, the quilt around her again, and carved a new figure from soft wood Cal had brought her. It was an owl this time, wings just beginning to unfurl. Cal watched her hands move, gentle but sure. "You okay?" he asked finally. Aya didn't look up. He wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to me, but he was the one they all excused. Cal sat beside her. "You don't owe anyone anything." "I know," she said, "but knowing and believing are different. You're not going back." "No." She glanced at him now. "Because for once I don't want to disappear." Cal swallowed. "Then stay. I might not be whole. You're here. That's enough." The owl took shape between them, carved from quiet and survival, and one long burning defiance. After Crow Harper rode back into the silence that had once shaped him, something shifted. Not just in the air, but in the way the light fell through the barn slats, in the way the frost curled around the porch steps, in the sound of the wind. No longer watching, but listening. For 3 days, Aya Morningstar moved through the house with the quilt still wrapped around her, but she didn't hug the walls. She stood fully in doorways, sat at the table, answered softly when spoken to. She swept without being asked. She peeled apples for stew. She let Eleanor Whitmore braid her hair once, and though neither woman said anything about it, something unspoken passed between them, not approval, not forgiveness, but recognition. On the 4th morning, Aya collapsed. Cal found her curled against the wall of the barn, her body shivering hard enough to make her teeth chatter. Her skin was hot, damp with fever, and her breath came ragged like it had to claw its way out. For a moment he thought she was hallucinating again, whispering in a language he didn't understand. But then he realized she was calling for water. He wrapped her in the quilt, lifted her light frame into his arms, and shouted for help as he ran. Eleanor met him on the porch. No questions, no fear, just action. She flung the door open and led them to the parlor where an old cot hadn't been used in years. Gideon stepped aside without a word, setting his rifle on the mantel and pressing his lips into a thin, unreadable line. For the next 3 days, the house held its breath again, this time for different reasons. Eleanor brewed teas from dried ginger root and willow bark. Cal sat by Aya's side day and night, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, feeding her broth spoon by spoon when she was awake enough to take it. He whispered stories to her about his grandmother's garden, the way the fireflies looked over the cornfield in summer, the time he tried to ride a calf and landed in a mud pit. He didn't know if she heard any of it. But he stayed. She was halfway to the ridge again, Eleanor said once, stepping out of the room and into Gideon's waiting slants. But something held her here. What Gideon asked. Something stronger than fever, she answered. Stronger than fear. On the 4th night, just past midnight, Aya opened her eyes. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Cal had fallen asleep beside the cot, knees pulled to his chest, a folded blanket covering his lap. She turned her head slowly, her muscles resisting but not refusing. "Cal," she whispered. His eyes snapped open. He leaned forward, breath caught. "You're back," he said, his voice breaking. "I tried to leave," she said weakly. "I know, but I kept remembering." Her voice cracked. "The way you looked at me, like I wasn't broken. You weren't. I was, not to me." She reached out, then her hand trembling but warm. He took it not with urgency, but with the care of someone who knew what it meant to be invited in without knocking. "You shouldn't have waited," she whispered. "I didn't follow you," he replied. "I waited. There's a difference." In the days that followed, her strength returned slowly like snow melting under winter sun. She began to walk again, first across the room, then to the porch, and finally one cold morning to the edge of the barn where she'd first been found. The place didn't haunt her. It acknowledged her, like the land remembered. Gideon rarely spoke, but one evening as he watched her brush down one of the horses, he muttered, "She's not like the rest of them." Eleanor, without lifting her eyes from the stew she was stirring, replied simply, "No one is, until you bother to see them." The biggest change wasn't in Aya. It was in the town. It started small, a knock at the door. A young boy from down the road bringing a jar of peach preserves. He didn't say a word, just set it on the step and ran. Then an old woman whom Eleanor hadn't spoken to since spring came by with extra wool. 2 more families followed, asking nothing, bringing bread, dried herbs, a knitted cap. Some just stood in the doorway silent, like they weren't sure what they were here to witness, only that they had to come see for themselves. Cal watched it all with something like awe. "What's happening?" he asked Aya as they sat on the barn threshold one afternoon. "They're not here for answers," she said. "They're here to see if you meant it." He looked down at his hands. "Did I?" She smiled faintly. "You're still here, aren't you?" That night, as the wind howled and the fire snapped inside the hearth, Eleanor told a story over supper, one from her childhood when she found a wounded fox in the woods and tried to raise it in secret. It had run away after 2 weeks and she thought it had died, until months later it returned to sit at the edge of the tree line, watching, not coming closer, not running either, just being there. "Some things," she said, "don't belong to you, but they remember where it was safe." Aya didn't speak. But Cal saw the way she gripped the cup of tea Eleanor had poured for her, holding it like an anchor. When she rose the next morning, the air smelled of coming snow. She walked to the top of the hill behind the barn, the quilt trailing behind her like a flag stitched by something older than nations. Cal followed at a distance. She turned to him at the crest breath clouding the air. "I was going to leave today." He swallowed. "Why didn't you?" She met his eyes. "Because I remembered your voice when you said my name. No one's ever said it like that." He nodded, afraid speaking would make her vanish again. "I'm not sure I know how to stay," she added. "You don't have to," he said. "Just don't go before you're ready." She looked at him for a long moment, then reached for his hand. Not with fragility this time, but intent. And just like that, she stayed. Snow returned 2 days after Aya chose not to leave. Not a storm, just a soft, steady hush that blanketed the fence rails and turned the ground white with quiet. The land felt gentler somehow, as if it had exhaled a breath it had held since the day Cal first found her near the fence. Inside the house, things moved differently too. Gideon spoke less with suspicion and more with silence that gave room. Eleanor no longer watched Aya like she might vanish. Instead, she handed her an extra pair of wool socks, then walked away without a word. The way women sometimes offer love when they've run out of language. Cal didn't ask Aya to stay again. He didn't have to. She had begun tending the morning fire without prompting, feeding the horses with him in rhythm, sometimes humming a melody he didn't recognize but had come to wait for. And when the neighbors started visiting, not out of fear but of curiosity, of hope, she met them with her chin lifted and her words few. Some stayed to sit, others offered preserves or dried herbs. A few said nothing, only leaving small objects on the fence, a carved spoon, a red ribbon, a broken compass. Gestures without demands. One night, Cal found Aya sitting at the edge of the barn loft, the stars overhead burning clean and sharp. She held the little owl he'd watched her carve weeks earlier, wings outstretched, eyes closed in peace. "This was going to be a gift," she said, "for someone who helped me find my name again." He looked at her, but she wasn't watching him. She was looking out at the horizon like it had once been a threat and now might be a promise. "You gave me quiet before I knew I needed it," she added. He didn't reply. He just sat beside her, hands cold, heart full. Later that week, a letter came by courier, not addressed to anyone by name, just marked in charcoal with a symbol Aya recognized. It came from a distant settlement where Comanche had gathered to replant roots after the last treaty. The seal had been broken and resealed twice. Inside it bore a request, not an order. "You are welcome to return, not as belonging but as remembered." She didn't answer it, not yet. But that evening she stood in the center of the barn and said aloud, "If I leave, I will come back, because now I know what it means to return." Cal helped Gideon rebuild the barn gate that spring. The old posts had sagged, weather-worn and splintered, but the new ones stood firm straight. Eleanor stitched a second quilt by the hearth, not because the first had worn out, but because, as she said, "Winter comes again, and it's better to be ready with warmth than regret." Aya began teaching Cal how to carve. Not animals this time, but patterns, stories in wood, circles within circles, rising lines that looked like rain and meant healing. She taught him a word in her language that meant held but not owned. He didn't try to say it back, he just remembered it. By the end of the season, the barn looked different. Not newer, not cleaner, just earned. It held the shape of the things that had happened there, a girl who hadn't died, a boy who stayed, a family that changed because of both. When the last frost melted and the chickens began laying again, Cal found a small wooden token tucked inside his coat pocket. A fox curled asleep. He didn't ask who left it. Some thank yous don't need to be spoken. Some endings don't come with farewells. They come with firewood stacked a little higher, with a woman humming while she sweeps a floor she was once dying on, with a boy placing another carved figure beside the others. Not because it's finished, but because it belongs. And across the hill where the watchers once stood, there is only open sky now. Some of the most powerful acts of healing in life come not through grand gestures, but through quiet choices, small, consistent acts of presence that say, "I see you," without needing to be loud about it. In a world that often celebrates force, noise, and control, this story reminds us that gentleness can be revolutionary. Cal didn't rescue Aya with heroism. He offered her a quilt. He stayed. And in doing so, he helped someone remember they were more than what they'd survived. Too often, people carry wounds in silence because they've been taught they're too broken to belong. Aya's journey reminds us that being cared for, truly seen without being fixed, can be terrifying when all you've ever known is abandonment. But it's also what makes healing possible. Love, when it's chosen freely and not demanded, becomes a home. And that home doesn't have to be built with walls. It can be made from permission, understanding, and the simple gift of staying near. The world doesn't always change in big moments. Sometimes it changes because one person chose kindness when no one was watching. Because someone said, "You don't have to go yet," and meant it. Because silence was filled not with fear, but with patience. In the end, we all long for the same thing: to be welcomed not as saviors or victims, but as ourselves. And perhaps the truest kind of belonging is found not in where we come from, but in where we are finally allowed to rest, to be warm, and to be known. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet strength it takes to stay, to heal, or to offer a simple kindness, then you're in the right place. Frontier Reverie is where forgotten voices, broken hearts, and brave choices find a home. Here we don't just tell Western tales, we tell human stories of redemption, of chosen family, of fires that never went out. So if you believe that tenderness can be just as strong as grit, if you carry your own scar but still choose to love, subscribe, share, stay a while, because some stories deserve to be remembered and you deserve to be seen. Welcome to the frontier, where Reverie becomes legacy.